Good morning, everybody, and you're very welcome to Policy and Practices webinar today. We're talking about tracking the prospects of low-income households. So thank you very much, everybody, for joining us. It's great to have you on board. So what we're going to talk about today, I'm just going to introduce you to our speakers in a moment, and you will see the slide that shows you their names and their faces. But before we do that, I just want to get you used, if you're not already used to the GoToWebinar software. On the right hand side you will see a panel within which you should be able to raise your digital hand, and if you could do that at the moment, please, that would help me to understand that you can hear us all correctly. And while you're doing that, in the same panel as well, you have the facility to ask questions, and we do encourage you to ask questions in that panel throughout the webinar. We have a lot to talk through, but please do jot the questions down as and when they come to you, and there will be a point at the end where I'll put your questions to the panelists. We have a couple of polls throughout the webinar. We're very interested in your feedback on what we're talking about, and also a survey at the end as well. And we will have you on your way by 11:30 this morning. Excellent. So in terms of your speakers, here are the faces to the names. Deven Ghelani. Devon, do you want to say hi?
Hello, everyone.
Martin O'Neill, Policy Advisor.
Good morning, everyone.
And Terrin Mathew from Policy and Practice, our Technical Analyst.
That's me. Hi, everyone.
Brilliant. They are the voices and they are the faces of people who will be speaking to you today. So if I just let you know that Devon is a thought leader in welfare reform. He worked on universal credit since its inception and has written exclusively on welfare policy. He believes the welfare system can work better and help people towards greater independence if we make it simple for people and organisations to understand. Devon set up Policy and Practice to make the welfare system simple to understand, and our analysis helps local authorities across the UK to use data to identify affected households. Our software shows people how they'll be impacted by reforms and what they can do to improve their situation. We do have a proven impact on people's lives, we're proud to say. Devon is also a founding member of the Welfare Reform Club. Martin has been a practicing welfare benefits professional for over 20 years, working his way up from an assessment clerk for rate rebate to becoming the head of benefits at Birmingham City Council. There he oversaw the administration of over £550 million worth of housing benefit expenditure and took the needs of 155,000 vulnerable people into account. He was then and remains now an advocate of exploring the reasons for poverty and then taking action to reduce and avoid current and future incidences of it in our society. He was instrumental in establishing Birmingham's Welfare Reform Multi-Agency Committee and overseeing the successful implementation of the reforms in the largest benefit service in the UK. Currently, Martin is a freelance policy advisor now and consultant, and he focuses on welfare reform, homelessness, and how to implement the complexities of current and future policies with the minimal hardship and disruption to people who are impacted. And we're delighted to have Martin on the webinar this morning. And then just on the right hand side there we have Terrin Mathew, and congratulations are due to Terrin, who is our technical data analyst. He has just very recently earned a distinction in his Masters in Business Systems Analysis and Design from City University in London. So well done, Terrin, and it's great to have you on board.
Great, and just to add my couple of voices, Martin, it's fantastic to have you on here. You are the main event. We've worked together when you were head of benefits at Birmingham City Council, and I was really interested in your perspective on tackling poverty, but also preventing poverty before people find themselves in those dire straits and some of the impacts that that could have on individuals. And Terrin, you know, well done on that distinction, but really what we're going to show you, some of what we're going to show you on this webinar is really what earned Terrin that distinction, because he's been working with us through that and developing ideas on how data can be used more effectively to tackle poverty and fundamentally track individuals through that. So thanks for those intros, Janet.
Excellent, good stuff. The agenda today, I'm going to give you a very, very brief introduction to policy and practice. We have so many people on the webinar today. I just want to make sure that you know a little bit about us for those of you who don't already know us. But we're going to very quickly get to the main event, which is talking about anti-poverty strategies, looking at them today and seeing what's missing, and also looking at some practical examples of how the household level data can help. We're going to have a discussion between Devon and Martin to talk about how the analysis can be turned into action. And as I say, there's going to be time for plenty of questions and answers at the end of the session. But do drop them in the panel as they come to you. Okay. So very briefly then, I just want to cover a little bit about what policy and practice do. I talked there about policy and practice believing that the welfare system can work more effectively. We think that it can help people towards greater independence if we make it simple for people and organisations to understand. We talk to government on a national level to influence policy so that frontline feedback is heard. And we show local organisations how individual households are affected by all policy changes now and in the future so that they can accurately target support. And also we simplify the welfare system by showing people how policy affects them personally using our software so that they can make decisions that are right for them. This is our onion diagram which encapsulates all of that. A little bit there just to re-emphasise about making the welfare system simple to understand so people can make the decisions that are right for them. And without further ado, I'll hand over now to Devon.
Great, thank you, Janet. And I think just to illustrate the onion slide, as he called it, you know, this idea of wanting to have an impact on policy was illustrated just this week. It's obviously a huge week for benefits with a number of changes that are coming into effect that I'm about to talk through. But one of the bits of analysis we wanted to focus on was this idea of limiting child tax credits to 2 children. We think it's a very controversial policy that really hasn't had the kind of debate it ought to have had, which is why we wanted to do some analysis on it. What the policy, as you'll all know, is that from this Thursday, a third child born to low-income families will miss out on £2,780 a year of tax credit support. That's worth about £50,000 for someone who is born on Thursday as opposed to being born on Wednesday. Our analysis found that the change is going to affect around 8,000 children born in April, but when you factor in the siblings it's going to impact, that means 1 million children will be affected by the end of this Parliament. 250,000 of those children are already in relative income poverty and will be pushed deeper into poverty. We found that just over another 250,000 are on the cusp of poverty and will then fall below the relative income poverty line as a result of this. And importantly as well, I think a lot of people don't recognise that this change is going to affect 70% of the children that this change is going to affect are households with at least one parent in work. So 70% of those households are working households, and by 2020 it'll be 600,000 children who are affected by this. So it's not a case of, you know, people who are out of work, as I'm sure many of you know. It's actually affecting working households. And this problem of in-work poverty is likely to get worse as a result of this measure. We also raised the fact, and the reason we're pleased with the Guardian coverage, although it perhaps would have been more useful 9 months ago, is that we really don't think parents are massively aware of this measure coming into effect, and it's going to be quite a shock in the month ahead as they realise that they're not going to be able to receive as much support for that third or subsequent child. So I mentioned that there's a whole wave of changes coming into effect. This is our welfare reform roadmap, hopefully a helpful guide to some of the changes that you can expect. The green shows that there are some positive changes happening, so things like a personal allowance increase, a higher tax threshold, which means that actually when you look at changes this April, net households will be better off because of some of these positive changes to tax allowances and other things. But what the analysis also finds is these red areas that particularly affect low-income households means that lower-income households are actually much worse off. So these don't actually net off necessarily for the same households. The positive things tend to benefit middle and higher-income households, whereas the negative effects to welfare benefits tends to just affect lower-income households much more, and in some cases very significantly. What our analysis does is it shows how some of these households are affected by many of these changes. So we can look at the cumulative effect, and we can do that on a household basis. And that's really the work that we kicked off doing for yourself, Martin, in Birmingham a number of good while ago now. So we did 2 reports for you. One looking at council tax support schemes under universal credit. I think that was the first project. And then later on we looked at the impact of welfare reform and the impact that the summer budget in 2015 was likely to have on children and families. So we produced, I think, for you a comprehensive and detailed report. And importantly as well, a household level data set that allowed you to drill down into individual households. You might want to say a few words about what you did with that, Martin, but I think after this I'm about to hand over to you for you to talk about what our newest service does. So what we've done and what we're going to talk through today is, and whereas these are sort of snapshot views, a snapshot report that shows you what poverty looks like in Birmingham, a snapshot view of how households are affected today. What our new service does is link that snapshot of poverty over time. So instead of looking at a static view of poverty, you're looking at it dynamically. So you can start to see who's moving into poverty, who's moving out of poverty, and what impact any interventions you're having, whether or not they're having the impact that's intended. So that's some of what we want to talk about. Martin, do you want to say any words about the work we kicked off with yourself before I hand over to you?
I think, Devon, it was just really a real eye-opener for us in Birmingham, being able to see such a rich level of data presented to us. We often, in local authorities, have difficulties in drilling, drilling down to the level of data that you can provide virtually at the flick of a switch. And having that presented to us in such a simplistic form was invaluable to us in terms of formulating our policies and strategies and informing those affected by the upcoming welfare reforms and the development of our council tax support scheme. So it was a real boost to our operations.
Well, it was a pleasure working with someone quite so committed on it, and I'm looking forward to your take on this. But I think what you want to talk about was anti-poverty strategies a bit more generally. Before we move on to that, I think we should kick off with our first poll, which, Janet, I think you're going to launch, which is really just to understand for those of you that are on the webinar, the attendees, it'd be great to know, based on the organisation you are, do you have an anti-poverty strategy today? Janet, do you want to launch that?
I can indeed. Thank you, Devon. So as Devon says, first poll, first of 2 today, and the question that we're asking you is, do you have an anti-poverty strategy? And please select one of these options. Yes, you do, but it's just another report. Yes, it's okay, but it's too strategic. Yes, it's both strategic and operational. Yes, it's strategic, operational, and we track the impact of data. Or no, we don't have an anti-poverty strategy. And as I am speaking, I can see you all doing your voting. Thank you very much. I should just leave it another little while longer to get your votes. And as I say, you're choosing one of these 5 options here. I think most people have voted now. Thank you very much. So I'm just going to close the poll and then show you the results, which are on the screen. Now, Devon, Martin, any thoughts on that?
Well, I'm struck by the biggest figure. Martin, what do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. 56% with no anti-poverty strategy, but encouraged that of those that do, the largest percentage states that it's both strategic and operational. So those of you that have got them, the majority seem to have something that's quite a usable format. So that's good.
Yeah, I think if you I was going to say, if you are going to put effort into these, it is worthwhile doing, thinking about them and doing them properly. Martin, I'm going to hand over to you now to talk a little bit more about your take on Birmingham's anti-poverty strategy.
Okay, thanks, Devon. Just to explain to everyone, obviously Birmingham's the biggest local authority in the country. Inevitable that there's going to be poverty in the city, and the City Council made some moves in 2015 to really start to tackle this and set up an independent child poverty commission. It was a cross-sector commission, and it was established to identify the extent of child poverty in particular in the city and to make recommendations to tackle that through action. In response to the publication of national figures on child poverty, which showed that Birmingham had the second highest level in the core cities in the UK. And to break that down, it was child poverty in the city at the time was running at an average of 37%. That equates to 100,000 children in the city living in relative poverty, being in households where the income is below 60% of the national median. 4 wards within the city had child poverty levels running at almost 50%. So the City Council knew that we know these wards are suffering the effects of poverty. The deprivation maps that we produce year on year showed the same wards with the same levels of deprivation, but nothing really seemed to change. So in the spirit of trying to actually do something to tackle poverty, we set up the Child Poverty Commission. And if we move on to the next slide, I'll show you what the Commission came up with. It produced a report. There's a screenshot of it. It is available online if anyone wants to have a read of it in detail. It's very interesting. There were 24 recommendations that came out of the report, and what that provided really for the city is a toolkit to tackle anti-poverty issues based on 4 key themes. Raising aspirations, and that's about raising aspirations for both the children in low-income households and the parents, particularly through giving them a voice and representation at levels where people can learn about the issues facing families in poverty. So that was the raising aspirations theme. Also, 3 other big themes about mitigating the impacts of existing poverty, sharing responsibility, and breaking the cycle of poverty in the city. And we've got a few slides that go into those in a little bit more detail. If you just flick on, Devon. Great. So mitigating the impacts and the effects of existing poverty in the city is really all about providing support for those in poverty to meet the day-to-day challenges that poverty brings, including, interestingly, introducing breathing space for those people in relation to council tax and other multiple debts and arrears. So give them some chance to take stock of where they are rather than forging ahead with recovery action that just compounds the problem. And also the use of bailiffs for families in receipt of council tax support. That's a measure that was implemented so that we did not send any council tax arrears to the bailiffs if families were in receipt of council tax support. Sharing responsibility is really about the responsibility for solving poverty in the city cannot solely be down to local authorities, and I'm sure those in the audience will agree with that. The causes and the effects are wide-reaching, and they need the involvement of multiple agencies to tackle those issues.
Hello, Martin. Janet, can you hear Martin?
Hi, Devon, we seem to have lost Martin at the moment, but I'm sure he'll be winging his way back to us as we speak. So do you want to carry on talking through the recommendations?
Great, I think we've got him back. Martin, I think you were halfway through sharing responsibility before we lost you.
Okay, sorry, I was just making the point that the report recognises that city councils alone cannot be responsible for solving the issues around poverty. It does need a multi-agency approach. So there were recommendations within the report to support that. And breaking the cycle of poverty, if I was lost during that point, was really about how we resolve the issue of families who are in poverty. Children of those families tend to have poor educational attainment, leading to fewer job opportunities and less chance to develop and flourish to their full potential. So we wanted to implement measures that would break that cycle. When I read the report in the way that I tend to be not critical of the report in any way, shape or form, but I just look for things as a practitioner with 25 years experience of dealing with people on the front line who are in poverty and in severe financial difficulty. Were there limitations in the report? And I felt that there were hidden challenges, such as identifying pockets of poverty just outside of the binary numbers and going beyond that definition of poverty to identify families, children, particularly lone parents and lone parents who are working, who are really not defined as in poverty because there's a specific definition within the report, those household incomes below 60% of the median. But what about those who are just on the edge and probably suffering just as much in terms of financial difficulties? So how well do those recommendations deal with those people, and can we find them? So as we go through the next set of slides, we'll be looking at how we prevent people from falling into poverty, helping lone parents who are working, what can we do to help people who are already in crisis, and most importantly, how do we track that impact? So with the help of some of the software demonstrations that Devon will show, I hope we'll be able to give you some tangible examples of that.
Great, thanks so much. And I think a really good summary of, I think, some of the good work, really good work that Birmingham's doing on trying to tackle poverty, but also a recognition that it can only do so much by itself. And also this idea of when I've always looked at tackling poverty and how we look at poverty, how we measure poverty today, I've always felt it was limited to. I always felt that poverty strategies tend to offer a static view of poverty. This is what poverty looks like today. But we all know that poverty is dynamic. You know, often it'll be you know, a shock to a household, a washing machine breaking down, that drives someone from being perhaps, as you mentioned, a lone parent that's in work, making ends meet and very proud of doing so, that can push them over the edge to having to start to borrow money, perhaps at unreasonably high interest rates or higher than they would like, and then they're then they're struggling all of a sudden. And actually, that's the kind of effect that has a negative impact on children and children's lives. So, you know, kicking off from something like that, I think what we wanted to focus on at Policy and Practice was to try and produce this dynamic view of poverty and talk a little bit more about what a deeper understanding of poverty would allow. So not just what does poverty look like today, but what did it look like for that household just beforehand? You know, were they someone who is in entrenched poverty? Were they someone who is doing fine and has just dropped in? And actually maybe they just need a little boost to find their way back. You know, being able to look at households on that kind of tailored basis is what we're really interested in doing. But Martin, you're going to dive into a few of those limitations that you talked about and some of those groups that you were particularly interested in. You're going to talk about each one in turn. So I'll hand back over to you, and I think we're going to do a bit of back and forth. So you're going to ask a few questions, and then I think Terrin's going to dive in and illustrate how our data brings this to life. Now, we're using Croydon's data in this instance because while we have done this work for Birmingham in the past, I think in terms of what we're able to show, Croydon have given us permission to use their data in these types of sessions. So, you know, it won't necessarily tie into your knowledge of Birmingham, but I think it really just illustrates the points you're looking to make. Over to you, Martin.
Yeah, thanks, Devon. I mean, this is the thing I was asking, and how do we prevent people from falling into poverty? How do we avoid that churn? So we tend to target our support initiatives at those people within the definition of poverty. So we'll take a lot of action to track these people down, hopefully introduce some measures to assist them and get them out of the definition of poverty. But whilst we're doing that, there will be just as many people dropping back in as their circumstances change. And that's what I was talking about, really preventative strategies to avoid that churn and help those who are on the edge and those who are often in work and on the edge. And as Devon quite rightly says, proud to be in work, but looking at their household finances every week and thinking, well, why would I bother doing a full week's work when, you know, the amount of money that I'm paying out is not worth my while? So I think the demonstration we're going to look at now, we in the city of Birmingham, we tend to look at ward level data rather than household level data, which just gives us that richer set of information to make informed choices. So is that what you're going to look at now, Devon?
Yeah, So I'm just going to hand over to Terrin actually to talk through this. So I kicked off with just a quick look at ward level data, but I think we're going to focus on the household level. Terrin, do you want to talk through identifying households on the edge?
Sure. Yes, so that view that Devon showed earlier is views I believe you'd be used to, where you see the poverty levels at a ward level. But what we've been able to do is take this a step further and then do it at a household level. So and this again is data for Croydon. Again, I'm just based on what you've said in the task. I'm gonna, you can see the filters on my screen. I'm just gonna see how I could address this, and Devon and Martin, feel free to interrupt me if you think I can target it even more. So to find those households that are on the edge, so let's look at those households that are perhaps not on the radar because they're not in relative poverty. So from the 35,000 low-income households, we filter it down further to about 7,000, I think. It's just catching up here. So let's look at those households that are not in relative poverty. So there were 7,000 households that were in relative poverty, 28,000 that aren't. And to find those that are on the edge, let's have a look at those households that are in arrears, so in debt. And that I think that brings the number down to 1,840 households. And you can see how we've brought it down from the 35,000 households to these 1,840 households, which we think are on the brink of poverty. But I think we can take this a step further, and you can see that there's this concentration of households here in the southeast of Croydon. But I think using some of the analysis that we did for Croydon, we can take this a step further. But because they had asked us to also model the expenditures of these households based relative to their incomes, and based on which we developed their financial risk levels. So we have coping, those households whose income exceeds their expenditure and they're coping. Then we have those that are struggling, where oh, thanks for bringing that up for me. So we have those households that are struggling, which have a cash shortfall of less than £100 per month. Those that are at risk, where they have a cash shortfall of greater than £100 a month. And in crisis, households whose take-home income don't even cover their housing costs. So I'm going to take this a bit further. From these 1,840 households, let's filter these down to those households that are at risk and in crisis. So they have a cash shortfall of greater than £100 per month, or they don't, or their income does not even cover, or their income does not even cover their housing costs. So again, you can see that there are these households in the southeast, and just looking at some of these here, you can see this. You can see these this particular household with a high level of arrears, probably double its rent. I think this household is on the brink of poverty, and possibly even at the brink of being homeless.
Great. So I think what you've done there, Terrin, is just narrowed down from about 38,000 households or so to a much more manageable number of 176 households, where you feel if you did have a preventative approach to tackling poverty, this might be where you target it and want to track your efforts. We'll drill down into this a little bit further, but I want to keep doing the back and forth with you, Martin. Just talk a bit about, if you've got those 176 households, what might you be able to do? And I'll flick onto the next slide, and this is, I think, the next thing you want to talk about as well.
Yeah, and I mean, straight away, it's the simplicity with which you can drill down to those 176 households and give me that very, very targeted set of data. But you can hover over each one of those little circles, and that tells me exactly where that person is, exactly what their household income is, what their household makeup is, and that allows me to go away armed with so much information to tailor the support for that individual household. And it also brings the numbers down. It's just the way that we work when we're in the practitioner's world, bringing a number down from 38,000 to a smaller number like 176. It just makes it look a lot clearer for us to put wraparound support, joined up approach across departments, looking at rent arrears, council tax arrears, giving time and support. So we haven't got a multi-pronged attack on those particular households, and we can do something about it with the data that you've provided.
Great.
This is another area of great concern to me, is the lone parents who are working, and I've come across actual people who are coming into offices in frustration at, trying to keep down a full-time job and yet having children that they need to care for. They make sacrifices themselves, so they'll go without meals, they'll go without recreation, they'll go without any particular life chances, really, at the expense of themselves in order to support their children. I would look at people just to keep them in work. They're often a forgotten cohort. They're at risk for multiple welfare reforms, affected by the third child rule that we just talked about earlier on in the presentation. So it's about developing coordinated and targeted interventions that will help from all parts of not just the City Council, but getting employment support, childcare costs, and just providing that extra time and breathing space around payment options and greater awareness of what they're entitled to. So income maximisation, benefit advice and money advice.
And I think that one of the issues that Birmingham, and I'm sure other councils face, is that all of this support costs quite a lot of money to provide, and I think one of the challenges is to make sure it's getting to those households that need it the most. So Terrin, I'm going to hand back to you, and perhaps let's have a look at some lone parents who are struggling in that way.
Sure. So again, I'm just going to bring up this dashboard here, which looks at the impact of welfare reform in Croydon. And again, just talking about a reform that we just talked about, the third child rule. So we can see that there are 8,777 households with 2 children or more that are at risk of being impacted by the third child rule. So we can click this and drill down to these at a household level. And then, so now we have these 8,774 households, and let's target it as per what you said, Martin, to those lone parents. So there are about 5,000 of them are lone parents. Let's look at those that are working age, that forgotten cohort, that are in work, and further, let's then combine their financial status as well. So let's look at those in arrears that are facing debt as well. So we brought that down to these 276 households. Again, you can see this concentration of households to the southeast, and let's take a closer look at some of them. So this neighborhood here, and just hovering over the household brings up details here. So we have this particular household with 2 children, a lone parent that faces medium income reduction, but they're impacted by the third child rule, but with quite a high level of arrears there, which is close to 1 month's rent.
Great, and we'll talk about drilling down into that in the next slide. But Martin, I think you've already run through some of the support that might be available, so we can talk a bit about, you mentioned coordinated support, whereby if they're in arrears to more than one part of the council, bringing all of that data together can be a smarter way of using your collection resources. And I think
Hello, Devon, can you hear us? Martin, while Devon is getting his sound confirmed, do you want to talk a little bit more, perhaps, about your experiences in Birmingham and this level of detail that we could give for you using the dashboard?
Yes, I mean, it's pretty self-explanatory what we're seeing here. I mean, the illustrative nature of the dashboard, being able to drill down to those individual households at such a rich level of data, It just equips us as practitioners with the information that we need. And the important thing is, with resources as tight as they are, we can all develop an anti-poverty strategy, but who's going to deliver it? So this enables us to target the resources that we've got that are reducing year on year to actually make an impact and make a difference, and also to engage external agencies as and where we need to assist with that. I mean, this particular slide is where we've identified where people are already in crisis, and what do we need to know about those households to personalise interventions within them. We need to know the household makeup. Have they had a benefit assessment, a DHP? Do they need employment support or childcare support? Is their situation getting better or worse? And this is about the multi-agency approach, really. I mean, in Birmingham, we set up a very effective multi-agency committee of all the third sector and voluntary organisations, as well as the City Council and departments working together to assess the needs of individual households using this individual household data. So there wasn't a blank approach. Are you back, Devon? Yeah, I was just saying the data helped us in Birmingham just not to develop a blanket approach to one size fits all for solving poverty. You do have to tailor your approach to individual households as best you can, and this is what the household level data helps us to do.
Great, and that's a lovely handover, because I think the next thing Terrin was about to show us was the ability to drill down even further.
Yes, just to confirm, Martin, you can still see our screen, right?
I can.
Okay, great. So again, the household that we just hovered over, this household in arrears, that lone parent, that we can drill down further and have a look at that household and get an overall picture for what that household is. So again, just to refresh your memory, this is a lone parent in work, 2 children. So if they have one more child, they're at risk of losing child tax credit for that 3rd child. You can see that their income exceeds the expenditure, and they have a surplus there, but they are in quite a high level of arrears. And in terms of interventions from the council, you can also see that they've received a high level of housing benefit overpayment. And further, you can see the impact by welfare reforms. That right now they have a medium impact because of the bedroom tax, but this could very easily become very high impact if the 3rd child tax credit will impact them. Can you hear me?
Hi, Devon. We hear you perfectly. Thank you. I'm Terrin.
Okay, great. And finally, yes, you can see the barriers. So they have high barriers. This particular household has high barriers to work because they're a lone parent. This particular household has young children. So there is a point here about the childcare that can help improve their circumstances, and even budgeting support to help bring that level of arrears down, I think.
Great. So I think the ability to drill down allows you to personalize some of that support. So if you do have budgeting support available, as you said, or if you're trying to think about where your childcare places should sit, that's where some of this information can help. Martin, is there anything you wanted to add to that as we move on?
No, I talked through a lot of that whilst you were reconnecting, Devon, but the important thing is that a lot of these people, the slightest change in their circumstances, be it household or financial, is going to drop them into the poverty trap. So it's about, we talked about preventative, it's proactive as well. It's proactive information that allows us to predict where there's a risk of poverty increasing due to any small change of circumstances, and try and take appropriate action.
Okay. Well, I think as people's circumstances change, I think the next thing we wanted to talk a little bit about was the ability to track and know that whether or not your interventions and what you're trying to do is going to have any kind of an impact. I mean, how did this happen, or how do you imagine this might happen in Birmingham? If you're working on something to try and tackle poverty, what would be your approach under the status quo of how you'd know whether or not it had any effect?
I think that's a really difficult question to answer in terms of tangible outcomes, because without the data, we don't know. and we can try and develop systems. I think the problem is you can come up with a strategy, but the strategy doesn't result in tangible outcomes that you can measure. And unless you've got that data, so without the data you do nothing. With the data you can track it, so you can set up indicators, you can set up measures of success based on what you started with in terms of numbers and what you've got at the end of a period. So, you know, that screenshot there shows about is your activity having any impact. I know from personal experience in Birmingham that we're trying to sustain tenancies for those in private rented accommodation and local authority accommodation, reducing moves into emergency and temporary accommodation, and the costs of eviction on average £6,000. We want to avoid that cost if at all possible. And, you know, the worst case scenario, 16 to 40 grand putting a child into care. And the amount of administration involved in these processes is just something that, you know, it pays back the investment that you put in to tackle the issues before they begin. So, you know, court processing can stop right at the end, and all the costs are wasted. So, you know, you are making an investment at the outset, both in time and money to get this data, but it's well worth it.
Great. Well, I think Terrin's going to talk a bit about tracking households and how you might prevent some of those moves into tenure and know whether or not those strategies were having any kind of an effect.
Yes, Martin. And as you said, tracking the changing circumstances of households was a tricky problem for Croydon as well. And this is a tool we built so that we could help summarize that information. So what you can see here is that we're tracking the cohort of households from last year, January 2016, and we're tracking them all the way to this year, January of this year. And right now we're tracking them by economic status. So you can see households that are out of work and in work. There's a big concentration of households that were out of work in Jan 2016, and they remained out of work. And you can see that's about 48.4% of the cohort. That's 19,000 households. But again, talking about poverty and tenancies, we can very easily just flick this to look at it by tenancy. So again, yes. So what we have here, the greens are temporary accommodation, social rent, private rent, owner occupiers, and council tenants, and you can see how their circumstances have changed over time. And specifically, as you'd mentioned, temporary accommodation and emergency accommodation, we can look at that in a bit more detail by clicking in. So you can see about 1,126 households ended up in temporary accommodation, but to see how they started out and from which tenancy types they started out, you can see they mostly, those that ended up in temporary accommodation started as temporary accommodation. But what's even more interesting, I think, is some of these other tenancies, like these private renters. About 129 households of private renters that became temporary, that ended up in temporary accommodation. Actually, 345 households that took different routes, but finally ended up in temporary accommodation. And you have these council tenants here as well, about 14 households that ended up in temporary accommodation. And yes, I guess that brings that point of the cost that you could incur, and the fact that you can even have a look at these households. So you have the 129 households here, but clicking on drill down would allow you to see where these households are. So you can see that they're in the northwest of Croydon mainly. The reforms that they're impacted by, further details on their demographics, and the barriers to what some of them may face. And you can very easily just download that data and combine that with your system for an action plan.
Great. So I think some of what we're trying to highlight here, I guess the so what of being able to see all of this stuff, is when you can see, for example, those households that are making that move into temporary accommodation, you might be able to understand the characteristics that are driving them there. So, for example, here you can see whether or not which reforms affected them. So 8 of these households are affected by the lower benefit cap. So clearly that's one of the bigger drivers. And maybe they could have had a DHP sooner in order to help them to avoid the situation that they're in now. And it would have saved these kinds of sums of money. I think we've had quite a lengthy discussion. Martin, I'm not sure if there's anything you want to add right now. I'm really keen to understand what people have taken away from that and whether or not they're seeing things that they already do, or whether or not they're seeing something that's interesting and kind of how they use data today. So Janet, I'm going to hand back to you to run that poll, if I may.
Yes, indeed. That's excellent. Thank you, Devon. So, as Devon says, second and last poll, we're very interested. How do you currently use your data? So I will launch that poll, and hopefully you'll be able to see on the screen here. You can choose all the responses that apply to you this time. So do you, would you say that you don't use data effectively? You have a corporate team that does that. You do that, but not very well. You use data effectively in your day-to-day role, or other teams within your organisation use data effectively in their day-to-day role. So please do select as many of those options as apply, and we're very interested to see your answers. And thank you very much, everybody. I can see your answers coming in as I'm speaking to you. I'll just leave it a couple of seconds longer to get as many people voted. That's fantastic. Thank you very much. I'm going to close the poll now. Excellent. And then if I share on the screen, you can see the answers here. Devon Martin, any comments on that?
From my perspective, it's reasonably encouraging. Martin, is there anything you want to pull out? Just in that proportion of people that do use data effectively.
I just think it is encouraging, as you say, and often a challenge to, I'm sure, many of those in the audience is that we've all got a day job that we need to do. So it can be a bit daunting being presented with all of these facts and figures, and really who's going to own the actions that need to go with them. And many of us have lots of housing benefit, council tax support claims to process and lots of money to collect. So this is a bit of an added extra. But the richness of the data and the dashboard takes a lot of the legwork out and allows you to take it where it needs to go to get the help and assistance and support to put these measures in place. And as I said before, it is a multi-agency approach, not just down to the benefit managers.
Yeah, and I think I just wanted to add two things really. For those that don't use data effectively, our approach to working with their data is pretty robust in the sense that we just take a data set from you. We remove all the personally identifiable information. We run the analysis through our modeling engine and upload that onto the server so you can access that through a web browser. For those that already use data effectively, they're some of the councils we work most effectively with. There's no doubt, for example, at Croydon, who we work very closely with, use data incredibly effectively. But some of the reasons we've been able to work well with them is that we've been able to turn it into something that they, for example, the ability to track individual households over time and their progress is not a straightforward challenge. And it's being able to bring some of that ability into their use of data and into their kind of tackling poverty approach. So those were just a couple of comments I had. Janet, I think it'd be interesting to pick up if there are any questions right now before we move on. But I think you also had a couple of questions for Martin and I that you wanted us to draw on.
Yes, yes, indeed. So I have got some questions from the audience. If I could just get them. I think possibly, Devon, maybe if you want to do these questions first, and then I can come back to the audience questions, just because some of the responses you give here may elicit further conversations. But first up then, this discussion point. So how, Martin, Devon, how do you feel, how can data help to turn recommendations into action?
I don't think one comes without the other. I don't think you can put recommendations into action without the relevant data. So one's reliant upon the other, and it's the quality of your data and how far you can take that data in terms of its detail and identifying location, household level data rather than just traditionally ward level data. And it's all there in a box. If I wanted a Christmas present as the head of benefits, I think this would probably be it, because it does everything that I can see needs to be done.
A different approach to answering the question and say, our policy and practice started by working with frontline advisors a lot of the time, and they're obviously people that are acting all the time in order to try and tackle poverty. So I think there are already actions out there that are helping people that many frontline advisors are doing. I think for me, what the data really does is make that join happen between the strategic decision-making, deciding what kind of policies ought to come into effect, and the operational activity that drives it. So, for example, all of that activity that I mentioned frontline advisors are doing every day, how do you know that that's as effective as it could be? How do you know it's getting to the people that need help the most? It's making that join happen that I think is particularly key. I was speaking with, we were in Haringey last week, and I think one of their challenges was, they felt like they were doing some of the operational stuff really well, but kind of, how can they, it was taking up so much of their time and activity that they didn't necessarily feel like they were doing enough strategic work. And I think what this does, that they were commissioning sort of periodic bits of analysis, so multiple snapshots of data and getting lots of different views. But I think what this approach to data does is go from a periodic approach to using data to something that's much more systematic. That I think is what makes that's the cultural shift that we're trying to work toward. And clearly there are some specific use cases that can happen before then.
Devon, I have a couple of questions around data, if I may interject at this point from the audience. First up, where do you source your household income data?
So we work mainly with housing benefit and council tax support data, but lately we've also been joining that up with information on arrears, housing benefit overpayments, rent arrears, council tax arrears, housing benefit overpayments, support payments, as I mentioned, council tax support, also discretionary housing payments. And we're having more and more conversations about bringing other data sets into that. So we're actively exploring adult social care data, children's services data, because we think, again, there are a lot of local authorities exploring this individually, but the position we're in, working with more than 50 authorities across the UK, is that we're picking up the best of, I think, what's happening out there and building on that with the team that we've got here, just to try and take some of that work away from you so you can actually apply the findings of what the data is telling you instead of having to work and spend a huge amount of resource in doing all of the analytical legwork.
Brilliant. And also, I think you covered off another related question there perhaps, but how do you identify those in arrears? Is that arrears with council tax? I think you mentioned the arrears there in your answer.
It's based on the information we get. So if it's council tax arrears, that's great. Housing benefit overpayments, that adds to that picture. If it's rent arrears, that can be even richer.
Excellent. Okay. Can you say a little bit more about data protection? For example, how is access to this data controlled?
Sure. I mean, Terrin can build on this actually for me. It's been a really big part of what we've done from the outset, because we know it's obviously a really important concern for local authorities and for their residents that this information is looked after carefully. So almost exclusively we work with non-personal data, so all of the information we don't need is redacted around sort of obviously identification numbers and things. We just use one primary identifier. So we take non-personally identifiable data, run it through our analytical engine, and that can then be matched back to the personally identifiable information that the data controller of the local authority will hold. A couple of other things we do are all of our analysis takes place in the UK on UK-based servers, and we meet all of the requirements. We've got a strong data sharing agreement that I think is the data controllers within local authorities are happy with, just given the number of local authorities we work with. I think that's clear now. And I think the point I wanted Terrin to come into is, I think even within teams, this is revenues and benefits data we primarily work with, but there are other teams that might want access. So, for example, frontline advisors. And I don't think it's necessarily appropriate to let them have free reign just to kind of explore, sometimes that needs to be controlled. Do you want to say a bit about how we do that, Terrin?
Sure. So I demoed different dashboards where I was demoing the household finances, the impact of welfare reform. You could even make sure teams have access to only particular sets of dashboards, only particular sets of filters, to make sure that those levels of audit remain. And yes, it's like Devon said, taking data security, because we have this information in a very accessible and a very understandable format. It's taking that level of data security and applying it through that dashboard as well, which is very important.
Yeah, so fundamentally access controls that can limit what people can see, making sure that they're only able to access the information they really need to do in order to do their job more effectively.
Excellent, thank you. I think you've answered the current set of questions from the audience, so more questions please, audience. But I know that you have another discussion point, Martin and Devon. So what happens to the analysis once the consultants leave the room?
Yeah, I mean, I want to pose this to Martin as much as anything else, because I remember you saying that was one of the, that's one of the challenges that you think people face when posed with data solutions, whatever they are, that everyone's got a day job. So I wanted you to talk a little bit about how you dealt with that and some of the challenges you faced. I'll talk a bit about how I think we try and tackle that through the dashboard.
I think we've touched on it, Devon, to be honest with you. I mean, it is about having that data available to help us to make more strategic decisions on the actions that we want to take if we're serious about dealing with poverty and any other issues that arise from the data that we've got. I've also mentioned the multi-agency approach, so that the feeling in the audience is that we're not suggesting that all of this work comes down to heads of benefits or heads of service or operational managers. They've got an involvement and they know a lot about the people involved in the data sets, but once the consultants leave the room and you're left with the big report with lots of data on it, what we did really is we used that report and that data to take it to the decision makers and the people in the council, senior officers and politicians. Once they're presented with that richness of data and it's illustrative, it opens their eyes to what issues are there and helps to get assistance and support financially and in and out of the council to help to deliver some of the actions and the commission report that was produced for Birmingham. Although it was commissioned by the City Council, it was actually led by Birmingham University and various organisations around the city as an independent commission to find out what we do with that data and what actions come from it and who has to deliver those actions. So that's really what I would say. It just gives you the tools kit to go and get the help and support that you need to solve some of the problems that exist.
And I think from our perspective, Martin, I think reports of, and we started off by doing a welfare reform impact assessment report and then producing a snapshot of data. And what reports are great at doing is making a case for resources, and as you say, trying to influence decision makers around the big decisions, the strategic decisions that need to be taken. The reason we sort of have built on that by moving toward this dashboard approach is, well, that's great. I think what we wanted to do was make it much more operational, and some of the feedback we were getting is the data is great, but how do we know it's current? How do we know it's up to date? Can we track changes? So really the development of the dashboard is very much in response to the feedback we've had from the people that were trying to do much more with it. And I think this is a really powerful way of doing some of that. Before we wrap up and take any final questions, I just wanted to touch on the fact that this is being used right now. So we've been kindly given permission to share and use some of the analysis we've done for Croydon in this. Mark Fowler, who we're working closely with there, I think is implementing a very successful multi-agency approach, certainly within the council, to drive analysis forward. I think what we've got is policy and practice. We're working with them to develop an information that supports and informs and helps us monitor the effectiveness of the strategy they've got in place. And they're also deeply concerned about avoiding costs effectively, and that's how they want to make the case for that gateway service. Some of the ways in which they're doing that is within 6 weeks, avoiding some of the costs impacted by the benefit cap. So they helped within 6 weeks 68 households to come off the cap. Within that same time period, they identified 135 households that were losing less than £30 per week, who they felt could be helped through benefit and budgeting advice, which meant that. But the more important resources DHPs, other types of employment support were going to those households that needed at the most. They also used some of the analysis to catch some of those households that were on the edge, Martin, that you were concerned about, to secure funding for an in-work progression pilot, help some of those lone parents who are struggling the most progress. And they're also able to, for the housing team who work closely with the Gateway service, to split some of the impacts for residents in council homes versus those in other social tenancies, so they can see whether or not the work they're doing as a landlord, how that's compared to the work that other social landlords in Croydon are doing, and whether or not they're doing better or worse, and whether where they can do better. So there's just a few of the ways in which Croydon were using that, and they were actually shortlisted and nominated for that work for an LGC Award, which was great. It was great to be there with them on that. But I wanted to sort of just end this presentation by referencing a few clear examples of the impact that this analysis is having today in one local authority. Janet, back to you. I was wondering if there are any further questions.
We do have some more questions, and I apologise for those of you who need to head off. I'm going to try and get these questions in. I've got 3 I'd like to put to you, if I may. I'm very conscious of time. First up, Devon, do you get any cooperation or buy-in from DWP? This particular audience member says this can be a difficult relationship. Any thoughts on relationships with DWP and this data?
I think it's a very hot topic. I mean, again, Martin will have perhaps dealt with this from a local authority perspective more so. I think there's definitely a shift within central government toward trying to share data much more effectively. I think there are some serious barriers around that, both cultural as much as legal and technical. I think the legal and technical stuff can clearly be overcome. The way policy and practice deals with that is we work primarily with the information that the local authority holds, while at the same time engaging with DWP and engaging at Westminster around their plans for using, say, universal credit data in the future, so we can influence how they're going to be using that in a way that doesn't just deliver value and benefit to the Department for Work and Pensions, but also can be used in a way that helps social landlords, that helps local authorities, and helps really gets the most value for the public out of this information.
Great stuff, thank you. Devon, I have a question, which I'm going to roll a couple of questions into one if I may, but what would you say to organisations who are on the webinar today who perhaps are not Birmingham and not Croydon, so they're not a large council and perhaps don't necessarily have the same level of resources, or indeed they may be a housing association. How may those people get access to this dashboard or benefit from the analysis?
Well, I think it's just as I think I guess the value case is very much the same. And Martin, you might want to sort of talk about this, because I know since leaving Birmingham, you've been doing some work with smaller local authorities. If you've got any perspectives on that, just that you want to chip in.
It's a valid point, because we've saw demonstrations with relations to data on 2 very large councils here, but the issues are generic across, large metropolitan councils, county councils, district councils. The numbers might be different, but the issues are the same. And the reaction that you and I got, Devon, if you remember, when we were presenting the multiple impacts of welfare reform and the potential impacts of future welfare reforms, which you could also do with this dashboard, to the multi-agency committee. So once we got all of those people around the table, which included housing associations, law centres, the DWP were present, as well as elected members, senior officers for the council. So housing associations were present, and they were all absolutely on board with the information that we were presenting to them, and very willing to join forces together to tackle some of the issues that were as a result of that data.
Yeah.
So it's relevant no matter what the size, the issues are the same.
I think, and also the fact that the issues are the same. I mean, we're talking about quite big amounts. So if we're talking about preventing homelessness and preventing children going into care, those are really important social impacts, but also financial impacts at a time when that's something that local authorities need to focus on. And I think for me, if you're a smaller authority, one of the strengths you have is the ability to basically walk across the room and know the person who's in charge of, say, children's services. So actually the information we've got within revenues and benefits might be helpful to you. And in that way, I think it can have an impact. Using information effectively can have an impact much faster within a smaller authority. And I think Melton is one authority I think that has done that very well. We've worked with authorities of all sizes up and down across the UK. I mentioned over 40, you know, of all shapes and sizes, and I think some of the smaller ones have been able to just do much more with it because they've been able to cross that bridge sometimes a bit more effectively.
Devon, we can leave it there in terms of the questions. I think there are a couple of other smaller questions, but I would say that you've answered them during the discussions that we've had throughout the webinar. So thank you.
Great. Well, thank you so much for staying till 11:30. Those of you that did. Martin, thank you so much for giving up some of your morning to talk about your experience as a practitioner with over 25 years of experience, and talking a bit about some of the challenges you faced running a benefit service for Birmingham. Yeah, hugely. Are there any words that you wanted to sort of cap off the webinar with?
No, it's a big passion of mine, and it still is now. I'm not with Birmingham anymore, but I still work in the field, and these issues are very real, and we see it all the time. It's headline news. So anything we can do to develop our coordinated action plans, the better, really.
And your perspective on this has been hugely valuable. So those of you that are out there that want to perhaps get a professional, an alternative take on multi-agency working and how your authority can get the most out of that, Martin's contact details are on here as well as mine, and you can reach Janet and the team here at hello@policyandpractice.co.uk. Janet, do you want to talk through some of the next steps, and we'll say goodbye. Thank you very much, everyone.
Great, that's fantastic. Thanks, Devon. Thank you very much, Martin, as well. And just to wrap up very quickly, everybody, the webinar is ended. There will be a very short survey, which we'll be delighted to have you fill out for us. You will also have the opportunity, if there's any of the, if you'd like a one-to-one demo of the data set, Terrin or Devon or any of the team to walk through the data set with you one-to-one, with you or some of your colleagues, please do say in that survey. I appreciate that we had a few connection issues right in the middle there, so that might be beneficial to some of you. Thank you very much, everybody, for attending, and we look forward to seeing you on another Policy and Practice webinar soon. Take care. Thank you. Bye-bye.